digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined once again by Kathy White from CEW Communications, and we have with us Oscar from Unity. Welcome back, guys and girls.
Hello. Hey.
Well, why don't you explain very briefly for our audience exactly who you are and what you do? Because the last time you was with us, Kathy, you were somewhere slightly different. So why don't you tell us about your transition?
Yeah, of course. So I have two slightly different hats. So the first hat and the transitional hat is I have launched my own business in the last 6 months. So as a company, I'm still a
welcome
nappy, basically.
welcome to the jungle.
Thanks. So CEW Communications is a partner for scaling tech businesses. So we come on board to work with them in order to establish their key messages and the best channels in which they can reach their customers. So that's everything from social media to PR to events content curation through to guest writing, blogging, everything like that. And my other hat is I am one of the directors of Geek Girl Meetup UK, which is all about empowering women in technology.
And of course, the thing that we should let everybody know about why you are so qualified as CEW Communications to be doing all of those wonderful array of different things is because, of course, you were formerly the head of the charge when it came to the Tech Cities marketing and communications.
Yes, so previously I was the head of communications for Tech City UK, and prior to that I was the communications and marketing manager for Seed Camp, which invest into tech startups from around the world. And before that, I was in agency land. So I worked with a variety of different kind of tech ecosystem players. So everyone from TransferWise and Etsy through to Index Ventures and Seeders. Lots and lots and lots of different people that are kind of well-known established names within the industry.
In
now.
other words, you're very overqualified.
Yeah, I did like some weird maths the other day and kind of figured out that through all of the work I've done at Seed Camp, Tech City, my agency background, all of the mentoring that I've done at a variety of different accelerators, I can now say that I've been in industry for 5.5 years and I've worked with over 250 companies.
Yikes. That's a lot of companies. Oscar, let's talk about what you do at Unity. Let's explain to people exactly what you do at Unity because you are an evangelist. And I've had a couple of different people ask me recently what it means to be an evangelist for Unity or for Unreal because there are evangelists for both of you. And I just want to clarify exactly what it means to be an evangelist for our listeners.
Yeah. It's difficult because it doesn't do with religion, but it is kind of like preaching the good news of your technology, if that makes sense. So our job is to go out there and help people understand what we do, how we affect the market and stuff like that. Wonderful. I'm a bit different from most evangelists because, and I think we'll get into this later, I'm not technical, which is really hard to be an evangelist in the tech industry and not be technical.
Yes.
But the reason I get away with it is because I'm old and I've been doing lots of things.
No, let's be clear, Oscar, because you're a legend in the games industry. Let's just be really clear.
I do. It is quite funny when I get jokingly introduced as the godfather of mobile games. I completely don't deserve that. But it is hilarious.
I'm sorry, but when you've been around a certain industry for long enough, you just have to live with it. That's just the way that people will introduce you.
But the thing I try and do is really, and again, I think this is going to be relevant later, what I try and do is help people understand why games tick the way they do and the skills that you need and how you be successful in a world that's constantly changing. And the funny thing about, this kind of old idea of being around for a long time is that, you see similar things changing and churning and patterns forming, and there's still a lot of patterns that apply to us now that were still relevant 20 years ago.
So here's the thing is you've alluded to it a couple of times now, but the topic for today is a conversation I want to get into just because I was at a couple of different panels recently where there was this question that was raised that was almost kind of like you need to justify why you are in, whether it's the games industry or the tech industry, if you don't code, if you don't actually know how to code or you're not a developer per se, what is your justification for being within the industry? And I kind of felt like it was about time that we had this, we kind of, break it down a little bit, maybe just, brush aside some of these myths that exist, that in order to be in the tech industries, you really do have to be a tech geek and do coding and all of these other labels and misnomers that really mean absolutely nothing, because I think we can prove here within the context of this conversation, two very experienced people within the games industry and the tech industry respectively, And I'm reasonably confident, unless you've both been taking, evening classes and not telling me about it, that you are not coders. So I want to kind of get into this in the first place, just in terms of, from your perspective, Kathy, what the perceptions are for somebody who is in the tech industry that, can sit there and hold a conversation about exactly what needs to happen, but isn't necessarily going to sit down and write the code. I'm curious from your perspective as to whether or not you think that is an assumption or an expectation that some people have when they meet you.
Yeah, I think they do. And the problem is, and it comes all down to semantics, really. So when someone says to you tech, what is the first thing that you think of? So we use tech as a way of talking about an industry, and tech is certainly an industry, but it is an industry that underpins so many others. So tech really is, and it's an enabler. It's a piece of hardware, it's a piece of software that enables something else to occur. And that can be in a variety of different industries. We have this old school idea that tech is, geeky guy at computer coding, or playing with computers in some way. And it's a really, really old school way of looking at the industry, basically. I think there is an assumption that if you work in tech, if you're not within the tech industry, I think there's an assumption that if you work in tech, you are coding, you are building, you're doing stuff like that. But really, that's not what the tech industry is at all.
I think you're right in as much as it's more of the infrastructure, the framework. It's the cornerstone of what you layer on top of it. So in the same way that you put different types of bricks and mortar on top of that foundational structure, it's very different what you end up with.
Yeah, I mean, I like the bricks and mortar approach because, basically you think about any operation, any business that is operating, they are based in a building. Now, you wouldn't say that they are in property, right? It's a business that's within a building, and it's effectively the same with technology. I mean, we talk about all of these different areas of tech, and they are businesses that are ultimately enabled by technology, but they work within a core area or provide a core service. So that's why we now have tags such as financial technology, fashion technology, and all of these get simplified down to fintech, fash tech, med tech, music tech, ad tech, mad tech. It goes on and on and on.
It does.
And on and on.
It's a very long list.
But the frustrating thing really is that actually the tech word still has to be there, because ultimately these businesses, they are tech enabled, but the tech bit needs to disappear, because actually what they're trying to build is a product, is a service that is within an industry, and that industry is everything from fashion through to banking.
Actually, you just reminded me of somebody from the team at Unseen, where I forget exactly the name of the individual in question, but she labels herself not as a fash tech or kind of retail tech kind of person, but she calls herself, what was it, digital alchemist or something along those lines. She's an alchemist rather than a technologist. And I love that she's kind of coming at it from a different angle and immediately forcing you to think in a different way, because as soon as you hear that word alchemist, you're just kind of like, oh, hold on a minute. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're coding tech, but you're doing something very scientific. I get that. And I think that's quite interesting. But Oscar, I'm curious from your perspective, when you walk into a game studio, I know from my experience, when I've walked into a game studio, there is always a certain degree of assumption that inherently, just by entering, the hallowed doors of whichever studio, you must know something about the kind of nuts and bolts of coding to have at least been allowed entry into the building.
Yeah, 'cause obviously the doors open, the harps start playing.
Yeah,
the red carpet and the Mario starts running beside you. No, I mean, obviously it's not like that. Actually, let's go a little bit back to that housing analogy you said earlier. Because if you're in the building trade, you automatically assume that you're the person who puts the bricks down. Or, where do we think about the plasterer? Where do we think about the guy who's the electrician? The plumber. Guy can be a generic term. I have a friend of mine who's a plumber who decided that being a PhD in biology wasn't good enough, so she decided to retrain as a plumber. So, you think about this stuff. It's like, and there's some incredibly complicated things that go on, in terms of, sewage management and making sure you get clean water. And there's a whole bunch of technical problems that are going on in building a house.
Do it's interesting that you say that, because it is very accurate in as much as most people's perception of building is labourers, as in the people who put the bricks and the cement together. But they're really not thinking anywhere beyond that. in terms of other roles and other things that need to happen in order to even facilitate and allow those people to get on the building site in the first place and put those bricks and mortar on the site.
Precisely. And if you think about a game, okay, so what's going on in a game? We have some code, that is true, but without a designer, without artists, and even artists break down into things like environment art and,
front end, back end, all that.
Character art, well, but also art technology. How are you going to deliver the technical pipeline for making that art happen? How are you going to deal with the way the graphics engine works? How are you going to deal with the way the animation works? And there's a whole bunch of different practical kind of skill sets. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong, it sounds very complicated, but I'm talking about a triple A kind of setup, which might have dozens of people. But even in an indie studio, you'll have a division of labour. I mean, they'll use an existing engine, so they'll use something like Unity or some other providers apply, obviously.
Am I allowed to say it in the same call?
You can, I can't. No, I get on quite well with a lot of the guys who run other engines. But, but the point is that there are tools out there that, we have a term in Unity, democratizing game development. It's all about making sure that even an artist can sit there. But if you think about it, the artist is sitting there and will script through the logic of what they want to happen inside the game. Then at other levels, there are other kinds of coders who will deal with how the different computers talk to each other, sort of the network code of things. And you have yet other people who are dealing with the engine code development, and other people who are dealing with even things like the data capture of, how do we work out what people are doing? So in a game studio, you might have a data analyst.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Econometrics is the thing,
Oh, exactly. So you've got people who, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have thought about being in the games industry. But the skill sets are vast and broad. And that's what I love about games, is that it's one place where engineering and art and music and narrative, all these beautiful human things come together in one place.
It's interesting if we follow through on the building analogy. I remember somebody once telling me about some of the buildings in Canary Wharf and how there is one individual who's some kind of consultant, and he comes in and he will do all these various calculations for big skyscrapers, huge tall skyscrapers, because they have problems with shifting sometimes, when it gets very tall and the wind blows them at the top and all that kind of malarkey. And this person, what he does is he advises them on things like inserting pendulums into the building to actually counterbalance the weight that the wind is applying to the side of the building at the top of the building. And so sometimes he will walk in and he'll be able to make the exact adjustment and say you need to put a fraction of a milligram of weight onto the pendulum in order to stop the unbalance that you have at the top of the building, or whatever the thing may be. And it's such
forces or whatever it is.
Yes, and it's such a specialist thing. It's like I've never heard of it before until this person told me about it. But it is such a dedicated specialism type thing. And here's the thing is that from my perspective in the games industry, that there's so much hoo-ha around the development side of the actual game dev, kind of under the engine, if you like, under the bonnet of the actual studio and the process, that people actually forget that there are all these other roles outside of that part of the process, such as you say, things like, data and big data analysis and econometrics and, the commercial side of the business. And you've got everybody from just good old, marketing and advertising and business development and, all those things that actually require little to no knowledge of actually how to code or develop a game. But I think there is still this common kind of, I don't know what the antithesis of a rock star is, but it's kind of the tech geek version of that, which is the assumption that's what all people in the games industry, all people in the tech industry are like. They turn up and they're doing these type of very specific dev techie type things. And I am curious what you think from your perspective, Kathy, given that you run Girl Geek meetups and you're, working with other communities outside of the what some people might term as core community. What would you see as being some of the kind of inherent solutions as to how we could go about trying to shift some of those perceptions and those attitudes around the fact that there are some certain expectations that do make it incredibly difficult for somebody who is non-technical to really be able to take that first step into the industry when it's so incredibly intimidating to think that you can't step into the industry because you need to have that particular skill set or that particular knowledge?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up all the time with Geek Girl Meetup, and there are so many different things that need to be done across all of the ages, basically, in order to better understand what we mean when we talk about the tech industry. For women that are, say, they're graduating from university and they're looking at what prospects they've got in terms of future job roles, I mean, I think that the first core thing really is the more we can do to highlight women working in industry and show the variety of different jobs that are available when we talk about tech or talk about digital, that just gives people an idea of what's out there. For people that are looking at specific jobs in specific industries, so say hypothetical, someone who's thinking about getting into medicine or into the kind of medical practice but isn't trained as a doctor but just kind of wants to work within that field, or if it's something like fashion or even kind of media, I push on anyone to look at startups and to look at different companies that are much smaller and working in that environment. You don't need to be technical. I mean, ultimately, these are just new companies that are just slightly different. They're newer, they're using technology in a different way, and they need a variety of different skill sets. It's like any business. There are so many different business functions across the operations, across sales, marketing, product development as well. You don't have to be technical in order to do that. You can be someone that works really hands-on with customers. There is just so much to do. So one of the things that we've been doing at Geek Girls, we have our own podcast, and the podcast is all about highlighting different women in industry, but specifically talking about the job that they do. So it's tech, but it is, here is a product designer, here is a COO, here is a founder, here is a female entrepreneur that's decided to build a company, and she's not technical, but she knows her stuff. So that's one of the other big things. The other thing that I think really needs to change is we can do a lot in terms of highlighting role models, but unless there is a broader understanding of what the tech industry is and what the tech industry is doing, it means that someone who is maybe talking to their parents or is even younger and actually looking at what they should be studying, they're still surrounded by a really closed network that could have kind of embedded gendered assumptions around different industries, and they need to be educated as well. I did a panel recently with a group of exceptional women, all very senior in their field. There was kind of a CTO, group technology officer actually from Accenture, founder of E2E Exchange, and a couple of others, and they were all amazing women. And one of the questions I posed to them is actually, is tech a gendered word? Now, but think it all comes down to your own personal assumptions that you have when you hear the word technology. And there's a lot to be said for what advertising, media, books, schools, teachers, parents, all of these different things that surround everyone, and especially a child growing up, are doing in terms of establishing what technology means and the general assumptions that go with that, which is tech is for boys and girls should go and do something fluffy.
Do you know, it's interesting that you say this, because culturally it is one of those things that by the time they get to school, it is kind of a little bit too late. And I remember seeing this great video that somebody had posted where it was a kind of either a preschool or kind of a kindergarten, so very young, so maybe about 5-ish years old, the kids that were in the classroom, and they were being asked to draw pictures of different types of jobs of what they would want to be when they grow up. And so they were drawing, fire people and then nurses and doctors and all these different types of things. And then they were asked if they would like to meet some of these people, if they'd like to meet a fire person or a police person or a nurse or a surgeon. And they were like, yes, we want to, to meet one of these people in real life. And they opened the door and in walked basically a whole row of women who were all doing these different roles, and the kids were really confused. You could see their faces, the little children who kind of like, are you pretending? Are you playing dress up? And it's like, no, genuinely, seriously, this is a firewoman. She actually goes and she puts out fires, and this is a police person, a policewoman. She goes and she responds to, and the kids by that age had already got in their own mind a really clear set of ideals as to who could do what type of job based on their gender, even at that young age. And that's quite a difficult thing to adjust a societal cultural image of what children are already perceiving because of all the messaging and the media around them. And then the invisible biases that even our parents will have when they just talk in everyday conversation. They are already gendering most things, most roles, whether it's intentional or not. So I am kind of cautious and curious about how one gets around something that is so fundamental to society. It's a very big hill you're trying to climb, in other words, Kathy.
No, I know it's massive, right? But that's the problem. The issue with fixing this is that you have to tackle it from multiple different angles. And the reason that kids have this embedded in them, it comes down to the people that are around that child, and because their effectively their personal network, their little community around them is so small that if that community does, think about kind of gender in job roles, then you're not allowing that child to discover things or discover things that they might like. So, it goes back to the old thing of, you felt when we first arrive in the world, girls wear pink, boys wear blue. But it doesn't have to be like that. And it's, it's the same about, making little girls have dolls and boys get train sets. But the nice thing is that there are lots of companies now that are creating products that are engineered to getting kids to kind of start playing with tech and playing with code. And they're doing it at different ages. So you've got things like from a school age, for 8 to 11-year-olds, there's Code Club, and they've got an amazing balance. It's almost 50-50. You've then got a new company, Detective Dot. It's a female girl. The book is kind of targeting slightly younger kids and moving upwards. And it's a book, it's a story, but within the story, you're using words and thinking about problem solving. And it's basically an introduction into code. And her sidekick is a robot. You've got technology will save us, little devices that you can build with your parents, and it's fun stuff, but it's hardcore, it's tech, it's, you're building something and seeing the connections. And then you've got, it's on the tip of my tongue.
We've got the Raspberry Pi as well.
Yeah, Raspberry Pi is another great one. They're working directly with Code Club. There's lots and lots of stuff going on. Kano is the other one. So actually building a computer. So that's all happening. And the interesting thing is all of that is coming from entrepreneurs and founders that are within the technology industry in some form. And they've seen the problem, and the problem's not being addressed well enough, within the schools themselves or, by government in order to kind of get kids thinking about that way.
It's also been exacerbated by the fact the last 20 years or so has been basically a barren wasteland in technology teaching generally. I mean, the kind of ICT that you got at school was how to use PowerPoint, not how to make cool and exciting things. So I think it's really, if you think about the issues you're describing there, it's obviously easy for me as a cis white male. I'm ginger, so I can consider myself a minority. But it doesn't really count, I know. But hey, but the point is that even for for the cis white males out there, the access to decent education about what technology was like was shockingly poor. So if you think about how badly we're established as a country to be able to have the skill sets, given the context that we have one of the most exciting and innovative, tech creative industries in the world, and we're not even close to scratching the surface. And that's one of the things I think that's happening really positively in games as well is the way that games is being kind of seen increasingly as a form of entertainment, where it's being utilized by YouTubers and where it's becoming esports. And I think we are seeing, in terms of the audience, a much better balance, but it's still far off what it ought to be, admittedly.
I am curious, though, because I think, I suppose I have to thank my parents for deciding to give me a set of Star Wars dolls when I was a young child. And, my first experience with dolls was rather than a Barbie, I ended up with a Han Solo and a Luke Skywalker. So I don't think I even had a Princess Leia in the set. But I am kind of curious from the assumptions that people have going into the games industry, Oscar, that a lot of their cultural biases do immediately come with them into that environment. I think the games industry is a lot more culturally connected than, say, for example, the technology industry. And I don't mean that in a kind of an unkind way to the technology industry, but I do think that there is a certain assumption that you are going to walk in with a certain degree of basic pop culture knowledge and sci-fi knowledge and kind of genre knowledge, that when you walk in the door, you're going to know this stuff. And
I mean, it is interesting. We have kind of a double-edged sword in terms of what happens with games. So games is something which a lot of people go into for passion.
Yeah.
And it's a very difficult thing to get right because there's a difference between a passion for playing games and a passion for making games. They're very different things.
Do you know, it's funny you should say that, because I remember somebody from the games industry, the person who got me into the industry, once told me that essentially the games industry, for the people who do it badly, it's a hobby gone out of control, is basically what he called it. So, but
See, I
please
have
do
a different
continue.
view on, the way I describe it is games is the worst. So making games is the second hardest thing in the world.
What's the first
But
hardest thing?
the hardest thing is not making games.
Ah, okay.
So, it's like, it's a ridiculous kind of idea that we put ourselves through. There's a lot of work to make a game. And like I say, we've got all these different skill sets. And one of the interesting things about the cultural kind of connectivity is that we are a creative industry. So we actually crave these different sources of, insight, cultural behaviors, norms and histories and mythologies. We want all of that stuff. We're fascinated inherently as an industry in the potential material that we can then use to inspire us.
Well, that's where a lot of the richness of detail comes from as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's really critical. So, I mean, most game developers I know absolutely crave to have a fantastic even split of gender identity, cisgender, all that stuff, because it's incredibly positive in terms of as a melting pot. But like you say, the expectations are really interesting, because people think, oh, well, it's a male-dominated, it's white spotty kids in the 80s sitting in front of their computers, and it's not that anymore. We've gone from being that to being a proper industry. At the same time, though, a lot of guys, like me, have been working in games for a long time. We all suffer from imposter syndrome, because we sit there and we're thinking, well, I can't do all of the pieces of the puzzle, so how on earth can I possibly be a game developer? I mean, I've been working in games for 20 years and I still get that kind of emotional feeling. So people have got to kind of be helped through that kind of emotional boundary and say, look, what is it you want to do? Making a game, being a part of making a game experience is incredibly positive. But you've got to find out where in that niche that you have skill sets that already fit, and also where do you want to take those skill sets. So you might start off in QA. A lot of people still start off in QA. It's a very traditional route.
It is a very traditional route, and I do recall being quite surprised when I first heard that the CEO of Jagex at the time had actually started out in QA and had worked his way up through the ranks and was now CEO of the company. I just remember being quite, surprised and taken back, and then somebody was just like, but that happens a lot. People... That's the first role is through QA or customer services. But
if you talk to testology, for example, those guys want to encourage you to realise that QA can also be a career in itself. It's not just a one trick pony.
It's not a stepping stone to somewhere else.
It's an actual function. Same with community management. A lot of people from community management end up doing other things.
Oh yeah.
People who are doing game journalism end up getting involved in the industry. I think the point is that it's like everyone's got a book in them. Everyone's got a game in them. The point is about finding other people of passion whose skills complement your own, and find the right tools to realise.
So here's the thing then. Rather than ask the usual question that we would ask at the end of a digital jam session where we talk about, what is the big change that you think needs to happen, I'm going to ask you this instead. Assuming that our listeners, somewhere in amongst all of our lovely listeners, there are people who are thinking about getting into whether it's the tech industry or the games industry, and they're sitting back and they're kind of going, but I don't code, I don't know tech, I don't know any coding languages, and they're thinking about what school, night school class they're going to have to take in order to learn how to develop in C++ or whatever they're going to do. What would be the thing that you would say to that individual about how they can get into this industry and what they don't need to worry about in terms of knowing everything? Because I think there is that whole thing of you've got to know enough to be able to get in this industry. And I want to start with you, Kathy, in terms of what would be that thing you would say to somebody who's looking at it from the outside, looking in, kind of going, how do I get through this glass door?
I think that the big thing is everyone has skills. You've got transferable skills that you can apply across multiple different types of businesses. So I think the best thing to do, and this was very much my experience, just get into it. And it doesn't matter what role you do. I think startups themselves are an incredible way of just learning very quickly a variety of different skills and getting a little bit more knowledge about what's happening in the industry. So if you're, start of your career, or if you're looking at pivoting or whatever, try and get an internship, try and do one of the junior roles and kind of work your way up. I don't think you need to learn to code at all. I think, there are benefits to doing so. If you want to make lots of money, then do. like
they were in high
simple.
demand, coders.
Yeah, just a bit, right? I mean, you're looking,
Yes.
there's a shortfall
There's
in the
always
US alone
always a shortfall.
of
Mm.
that. Well, I mean, like, it's something ridiculous now. It's over the next few years, it's 1.5 million in terms of the number of people that are needed on the developer engineering side. And you just look at what like starting salaries are in Silicon Valley, and it's just like, oh, okay, maybe I should have learned to be a coder. But coding is not for everyone, and it's something that's not for me. My love is the communication, it's the talking, it's the creativity, it's thinking about how you get your technical product or technical company in front of people that are not technical. And there are so many different things you can do. So I think my big thing would just be get a route in, and you'll find, I find, at least with startups, that is a very good way of doing so.
Okay. And Oscar, what would be the thing that you would say to somebody who's looking at, from the outside looking in, thinking about getting into the games industry and just kind of going, whoa, how do I do this without coding? How do I do this without technical knowledge?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of ways I normally answer this, but I'm going to start with one. Where is your passion? So the interesting thing about games is if you want to make lots of money as a coder, go work in finance. If you want to make something you're passionate about, then know what that is. Understand what it is. You don't have to understand it entirely, but to understand that you have a passion for games. Like the joke about making games being the second hardest thing and not making games being the hardest thing, it's kind of got a point to it, which is that you're going to go through a whole bunch of hurdles and barriers and pushbacks and so on and so forth, just like in any kind of creative industry. The important thing is if this is your passion, then you're going to go through them. But by the way, go try coding. Don't be frightened of it. Go download Unity or one of the other kind of engines and try making a couple of the example games. I'm not saying go become a coder. I'm saying learn a bit about what code looks like. And you might find it demystifies it. And it stops being about this kind of crazy, difficult thing. Instead, it says, so all I have to do is I need to create, place a model, which somebody else has made in the 3D platform, put it into a scene, have a trigger that means that I map the button pressed to something. That causes the figure to start moving. Here's a line that figure's going to follow. Here's something, animation that means the legs move. It's all broken down into component parts, which are all very easy to understand. So don't be frightened about what tech means, whether it's games or otherwise. It is simply a series of understandable steps to deliver something valuable to the user.
I'm going to reiterate on what you're saying here, because I think it's actually quite important that there's a lot of people who are really intimidated by the idea of stepping into coding and tech as such. And tech, by tech, I'm labeling the entirety of anything to do with technical skills. And it's kind of interesting what you're saying, as much as knowledge is power. It's like knowing what it actually entails is such a powerful thing, because it isn't that complex. Coding at its barest, base level form is just logic. And you're just going through a series of steps to understand the logic of a thing versus anything overly complex just because it looks like a bunch of numbers and letters. It doesn't, it is actually very straightforward. It's very logical. And, what I would say to people is, look, if you've ever used WordPress or you've used, Wix or Weebly or any of these other, website building CMS type programs, then the likelihood is you're pretty much going to understand how to code, because it's not that complex, especially when you're using platforms like perhaps Unity or the other one, which we won't mention here. But, there is a lot of just drag and drop involved. There is a lot of basic assumption. Well, if you put that thing there, then you can't put the other thing there because, they conflict with each other. It's kind of very logical. And I think that a lot of people are intimidated because of the fact it's coding and because of the fact it's technology or techie, that they immediately become very intimidated by that. It's kind of like the same for people who might be, not very good at math. And so when you say finance and accounting, they immediately freak out. It kind of feels a little bit the same, where there is this inherent misunderstanding of what it means to be in the games industry or the tech industry, purely because it means that you have to have some kind of technical skill, which in reality you really don't. You just have to have a good logical mind.
And whether you end up being an artist or a marketing guy or a product designer or any of the other kind of vast myriad of parallel skills, that's a much better way to describe it. Having that little bit of understanding of what tech means will really just make it a lot easier for you. You don't have to feel worried about whether you should argue about whether this makes sense, because you can just have a conversation and they will be able to sort of break it down to logical steps and work out whether what you want to happen happens.
Mm. Okay, well, I think the main message is here, don't let fear hold you back. So, having said all of that, I would like to offer our listeners a way to be able to find out a little bit more about what you're up to. We asked you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. So, what would that be, Kathy?
So my social media handle of choice is Twitter, because I love it. I am at Kathy White 10, and that's Kathy with a C and 10 as 10.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And Oscar, what would be the social media handle of choice for your good self?
Again, Twitter is that place. I have the unfortunately historic title, which is always terrible to spell. It's my old role-playing game character name, which is at Athanasius. So Athaneus.
Wonderful.
So that's, I was going to repeat it, but hey.
We'll make sure it's in the podcast notes so everybody can see exactly how it's spelled. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of launching your own podcast? Speak to the GL Pro UK team, who handle all of our podcast service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Sessions sent you, and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com